Nietzsche wrote about him, that derisive and conceited Athenian freak and rat-catcher, forcing the arrogant youth to shiver and cry, was not only wisest among all talking heads ever living, he was also as great in his silence. Standing before the judges who sent him to death, the great philosopher Socrates said, "I shall not refuse of my philosophy till I breathe." Ancient Greek philosopher Socrates was born in Athens in the year 469 BC into the family of the sculptor Sophronius and Phanerete, a midwife. All information that we have about Socrates reached us through the works of his pupils, Plato and Xenophon, because Socrates himself was illiterate. We hardly know about the early years of his life, though it is known that by the age of 17, he had already become the favorite pupil of the philosopher Achilles. Aspiring to help his fellow citizens' moral perfection, Socrates talked to them a lot. On the streets and squares, beneath the shadowy olive trees, he discussed questions of justice and virtue. Giving discourses on philosophy without thinking about finding means of his livelihood drove Socrates to ultimate poverty. He went across Athens barefoot and shabbily dressed. His contemporaries were astonished. If the slave would have forced to live such a life, he would run away by all means. Socrates was so deeply immersed in himself quite often that one day he found himself standing on the same spot for a long time. Nevertheless, when the security of his native city was threatened during the Peloponnesian War, Socrates fought bravely, protecting Athens. When the oracle of Delphi declared Socrates to be the wisest man, the Athenian ragamuffin was extremely surprised. Socrates, wishing to refute the oracle, began to associate with those who, as he thought, were wiser than he was, the pompous teachers of philosophy, and eloquence called sophists. Pretending to be simple-minded, Socrates humbly questioned the men of Athens about their knowledge of virtue, courage, and justice. Then, with a series of tricky questions, he drove the interlocutor to a refutation of his own words. And then, together with his puzzled opponent, Socrates tried to release the wisdom which had laid dormant in his soul, just as his mother, a midwife, helped children to be born. The method of searching of truth by the leading questions Socrates has named meutics, the art of giving birth. Socrates came to a conclusion that he was really the wisest among people because, possessing as little wisdom as others, he at least realized his own ignorance. "I only know that I know nothing." Socrates tried to comprehend and formulate moral standards, which should become uniform for all people. "There is only one good, knowledge, and one evil, ignorance," Socrates said. He insisted on regular education for the Athenian youth, into which the poets and philosophers, and not the parents, should be associated with. The Athenian citizens grumbled. It seemed to them that they lost control over their children, whose hearts had been occupied by the crafty philosopher. When one young man asked Socrates whether it was worth marrying for him, and he answered, "Act as you wish, you will regret anyway." Socrates, at the age of 40, was married to 19-year-old Xanthippe, who was notable for scandalous temper. However, Socrates perceived his quarrelsome spouse with philosophical calmness. He was a bad family man and did not care for children. Athens suffered a defeat in the long-term Peloponnesian War, and the rigid Spartan tyranny, headed by Critias, the former student of Socrates, was established in the city. Though Socrates never cooperated with tyrants, but in 399 BC, after their overthrow, the Athenians brought the philosopher to the court on the charge of disgrace and depravity of the youth. Having appeared before the court, the 70-year-old philosopher proved with logical backing that he was not subjugated to trial, but to be honored as the society's benefactor and spiritual instructor. The judges became furious. Socrates was sentenced to death. Waiting for the execution, the philosopher spent the whole month in prison, talking with his friends by misfortune about immorality of soul. Before the execution, his friend Crito had bribed the jailer and suggested the prisoner to escape from Athens. However, Socrates refused, considering that it was necessary to obey the established laws, even if he was convicted unfairly. He fully drank to the last bit the cup of hemlock with a reasonable calmness and quietness. And when his friends who had been present at the execution began to cry, he put them to shame. The last words of Socrates were, "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius." Those times the cock was sacrificed to the god of medicine, Asclepius, after the patient's recovery. The words of Socrates could be regarded as the death of his body became a recovery for his soul. Recently, some historians of ancient philosophy not once attempted to prove that Socrates was only the literary character that had been invented by Plato for the greater importance of his own ideas. Nevertheless, the Athenian madcap, Socrates, became the new philosophy founder and the teacher of the many of great philosophers.